Hey you, stop right there. Do you even live here? The suspicious interrogation tore through the peaceful Saturday afternoon at the community pool. Directed straight at Vivian Holloway, a resident of nearly 10 years, and also the town's police chief. In Westwood, Massachusetts, a peaceful Saturday afternoon at the community pool was suddenly disrupted by a strange confrontation. The protagonist of this story is not an intruder, but Vivian Holloway, the town's police chief, who has been a resident here for nearly a decade. So what happened that caused a law enforcement officer to be questioned about her residency in the very place she calls home? Join us as we explore this surprising story, where the line between belonging and suspicion becomes more fragile than ever. Vivian Holloway paused, the bright golden sunlight streaming through the trees. The sound of children laughing from the pool seemed to dissolve into the quiet afternoon air. She had just settled into her familiar folding chair, savoring a rare moment of peace after a stressful work week. Yet, a curt, suspicious question had shattered the tranquil atmosphere. She looked up at the man who had spoken. Robert Miller, a relatively new face in the neighborhood, stood there with a scrutinizing expression, arms crossed as if performing an unwelcome duty. His eyes scanned Vivian's casual attire, a loose t-shirt and comfortable shorts, before settling on her hastily tied back hair. Devoid of makeup or a familiar badge, a wave of unease ran down Vivian's spine. She had lived here for nearly 10 years, knowing every corner of the neighborhood and recognizing most faces. Being questioned about her residency by a stranger, especially a newcomer, surprised and slightly irritated her. "Excuse me, what did you just ask?" Vivian spoke, her voice calm but with a hint of surprise. She looked directly into Robert's eyes, awaiting a satisfactory explanation for his rudeness. Robert Miller remained unfazed. His expression held its suspicion. "I asked if you live here. This pool is for residents only. I haven't seen you here before." His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to draw the attention of a few nearby people. Vivian took a deep breath, trying to keep her annoyance in check. "Yes, I live here. I'm Vivian Holloway, 14B. I've been here for almost 10 years. She replied, her voice firm and clear, hoping to dispel this baseless suspicion. However, Robert Miller seemed unconvinced. He smirked, a skeptical smile flashing across his face. "Really? Almost 10 years and I've never seen you at this pool? Doesn't sound very plausible." Robert's words began to carry an implicit accusation, making Vivian more uncomfortable. She realized this wasn't just a simple question but an evaluation. A suspicion based on her appearance. "I don't think I'm obligated to report my schedule to you, sir." Vivian paused, waiting for Robert to introduce himself. "Miller," he replied curtly, making no attempt to ease the tension. "Robert Miller, I just want to ensure the neighborhood rules are followed." "I completely understand your concern for the rules," Vivian said, trying to keep her voice polite. "But I assure you, I'm not violating any rules. I'm a resident here, and I have the right to use the common facilities like anyone else." Robert Miller remained unmoved. His eyes still scrutinized her, as if trying to find a loophole in her words. "Then can I see your resident card? Just for confirmation." Robert's request began to test Vivian's patience. Being asked to prove her identity by a stranger, based on unfounded suspicion, in the place she called home for nearly a decade, felt insulting. "Mr. Miller," Vivian said, her voice still calm but with a hint of coldness, "I don't carry my resident card when I walk down to the pool. But if you're really suspicious, you can check with the WA management. My name and address are both on the resident list." Robert Miller still seemed unsatisfied. He looked around the pool, as if seeking support from others. A few curious eyes turned towards them, but no one intervened. "I just moved here," Robert said, his voice slightly lower but still suspicious. "I just want to make sure everything's in order. We've had a few incidents here before." "I understand," Vivian replied, trying to be understanding, "but your approach and questioning, just because you haven't seen me here before, is inappropriate. I'm a legal resident, and I'm not obligated to prove that to you." The tension between them began to spread, like a thin but uncomfortable haze over the peaceful Saturday afternoon. The onlookers began to realize this wasn't just a normal conversation between neighbors. Something was brewing, a latent conflict that both Vivian and Robert clearly sensed. Robert Miller remained unmoved, his face flushed slightly, a sign of his growing stubbornness. His eyes were still fixed on Vivian, as if trying to find a hint of deceit. "I'm just saying I haven't seen you here before," Robert repeated, his voice a bit more sharp. "And with what's been happening in the neighborhood lately, we need to be vigilant." Vivian sighed, a soft breath filled with helplessness. "I understand your vigilance, Mr. Miller, but I'm not a threat. I'm a neighbor. If you really want to be vigilant, perhaps you should spend time getting to know the people who live around you." Vivian's words seemed to touch a nerve with Robert. He paused for a moment, his eyes slightly wavering, but in just a moment, his skeptical look returned. "Easy enough," Robert said, his voice challenging. "If you really live here, you must have a resident card. Why don't you show it to me?" He held out his hand, as if waiting for Vivian to obediently comply. Robert's action, his insistence on a proof that shouldn't be necessary between neighbors, made Vivian feel a simmering anger rising. This was no longer just simple suspicion. It was blatant disrespect, a judgment based on unspoken prejudices. Vivian looked at Robert's outstretched hand, then raised her eyes to meet his. Her gaze was no longer surprised or annoyed, but coldly determined. "Mr. Miller," Vivian said, her voice slow and clear, each word etched into the air. "I don't make a habit of carrying identification when I relax at the community pool where I live. And I certainly have no obligation to prove my identity to someone I just met." She paused, observing Robert's reaction. He seemed slightly taken aback by her firm response. But Robert tried to argue, but Vivian didn't let him finish. "But if you're still suspicious," Vivian continued, her voice sharp, "instead of continuing to question me unreasonably like this, you can do something much simpler. You can ask any of the people I've lived next to for nearly 10 years. Or, as I said, you can contact the WA management. I'm sure they'd be happy to confirm my residency." Vivian stood up, a gentle but decisive movement. She looked down at Robert, her eyes unwavering. "Now," Vivian said, her voice turning colder, "if you have no further questions, I'd like to enjoy my day off in peace." She turned and walked towards her bag, leaving Robert Miller standing there, alone with his confusion and perhaps a hint of discomfort. A few people around had begun to turn away, but Vivian could feel their eyes still following, curious about this unexpected confrontation. As Vivian bent down to pick up her bag, she sighed softly. She didn't want to make a scene, but Robert Miller's stubbornness and attitude had crossed the line. She knew this was probably not the end. Robert Miller remained unmoved, his face flushed slightly, a sign of his growing stubbornness. His eyes were still fixed on Vivian, as if trying to find a hint of deceit. "I'm just saying I haven't seen you here before," Robert repeated, his voice a bit more sharp. "And with what's been happening in the neighborhood lately, we need to be vigilant." Vivian sighed, a soft breath filled with helplessness. "I understand your vigilance, Mr. Miller, but I'm not a threat. I'm a neighbor. If you really want to be vigilant, perhaps you should spend time getting to know the people who live around you." Vivian's words seemed to touch a nerve with Robert. He paused for a moment, his eyes slightly wavering, but in just a moment, his skeptical look returned. "Easy enough," Robert said, his voice challenging. "If you really live here, you must have a resident card. Why don't you show it to me?" He held out his hand, as if waiting for Vivian to obediently comply. Robert's action, his insistence on a proof that shouldn't be necessary between neighbors, made Vivian feel a simmering anger rising. This was no longer just simple suspicion. It was blatant disrespect, a judgment based on unspoken prejudices. Vivian looked at Robert's outstretched hand, then raised her eyes to meet his. Her gaze was no longer surprised or annoyed, but coldly determined. "Mr. Miller," Vivian said, her voice slow and clear, each word etched into the air. "I don't make a habit of carrying identification when I relax at the community pool where I live. And I certainly have no obligation to prove my identity to someone I just met." She paused, observing Robert's reaction. He seemed slightly taken aback by her firm response. But Robert tried to argue, but Vivian didn't let him finish. "But if you're still suspicious," Vivian continued, her voice sharp, "instead of continuing to question me unreasonably like this, you can do something much simpler. You can ask any of the people I've lived next to for nearly 10 years. Or, as I said, You can contact the WA management. I'm sure they'd be happy to confirm my residency." Vivian stood up, a gentle but decisive movement. She looked down at Robert, her eyes unwavering. "Now," Vivian said, her voice turning colder, "if you have no further questions, I'd like to enjoy my day off in peace." She turned and walked towards her bag, leaving Robert Miller standing there, alone with his confusion and perhaps a hint of discomfort. A few people around had begun to turn away, but Vivian could feel their eyes still following, curious about this unexpected confrontation. As Vivian bent down to pick up her bag, she sighed softly. She didn't want to make a scene, but Robert Miller's stubbornness and attitude had crossed the line. She knew this was probably not the end. Robert Miller wasn't ready to give up. His face still held an expression of displeasure and suspicion. As Vivian turned her back, he remained standing, watching her silhouette with an unfriendly gaze. This incident seemed to have struck a nerve in his pride and also touched upon some deep-seated prejudices within him. "Hold on," Robert suddenly exclaimed, his voice louder, drawing the attention of those around them once more. "I'm not finished with this. You talk a good game, but who knows if you really live here?" Vivian paused, but didn't turn around immediately. She stood there, her back to Robert, clearly feeling the tension spreading through the air. She knew that if she continued to walk away, Robert might take advantage of the situation, and the matter could escalate unnecessarily. Slowly, Vivian turned to face Robert. Her eyes were cold and determined. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice lowered but still audible to those nearby, "I don't understand what your real purpose is. Are you suspicious of me just because you haven't seen me here before? Or is there another reason?" Vivian's direct question seemed to fluster Robert slightly. He stammered, I just want to ensure the neighborhood's security. We've had warnings about strangers. And you think I'm that stranger?" Vivian interrupted, her voice sharp as a knife. "Based on what? My appearance? Or simply because I don't look like what you expect?" Vivian's words touched a sensitive issue, making the surrounding atmosphere heavier. A few witnesses began to whisper, their eyes shifting between Robert and Vivian, filled with curiosity and a subtle sense of agreement with Vivian. Robert Miller felt everyone's attention focused on him. He tried to maintain his determined expression, but a hint of awkwardness began to show in his voice. "I didn't mean it like that. What I mean is, everyone should prove their residence when asked." "Prove to whom?" Vivian asked, her voice still unwavering. "Prove to a newcomer who hasn't taken the time to get to know his neighbors." "Mr. Miller, your security assurance is based on suspicion and unreasonable demands. That's not how you build a community." Robert Miller clenched his fists, his face turning red. Vivian's strong resistance made him feel challenged. "You're deliberately making this difficult," Robert said, his voice almost growling. "If you have nothing to hide, why don't you just show me the damn card?" Robert's loss of composure raised Vivian's eyebrow. This was the first time he had used such rude language. It revealed his anger and perhaps his helplessness. "I won't comply with your unreasonable request just because you suspect me," Vivian retorted, her voice maintaining surprising control. "If you really want to know who I am, I've given you ways to verify. Your continued demand for me to prove myself only shows your disrespect and arrogance." She took a step closer to Robert, the distance between them now very close. Vivian's eyes locked onto Robert's, unwavering. "And Mr. Miller," Vivian said, her voice soft but powerful, "I advise you to be careful with your words and actions. Because in this community, like anywhere else, respect is something to be given, not demanded through suspicion and rudeness." The tension between them was like a taut string, stretched to the point of breaking. The onlookers watched in silence, no one daring to intervene. They sensed that this was not just a minor argument, but a confrontation about power, belonging, and the unspoken prejudices within each person. Robert Miller stood frozen, Vivian's words seeming to have crossed a line within him. His flushed face still held a hint of anger, but his eyes now showed a flicker of hesitation, a vague sense of confusion. Perhaps, under the watchful eyes of his silent neighbors, his initial determination began to waver. He looked around, scanning the curious faces, some with doubt, and perhaps some with sympathy for Vivian. The support he seemed to have expected from those around him was not forthcoming. Instead, he felt himself becoming the center of attention in a negative way. Robert began, his voice losing its earlier arrogance, becoming more hesitant. I just wanted to make sure. Make sure of what, Mr. Miller? Vivian interrupted gently but with weight. Make sure someone like me doesn't belong here? Vivian's question hung in the air, like an unspoken accusation. Robert Miller seemed to choke on his words. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure how to respond. Just as the silence became heavy, a voice rang out from a nearby chair. Everything all right over there, Vivian? It was Carl, the older man in the baseball cap who had spoken up earlier. He looked at Robert with a direct and somewhat stern gaze. Robert Miller startled, his eyes shifting to Carl. Carl's intervention, from someone clearly a longtime member of the community, seemed to break the stalemate. Vivian nodded slightly at Carl. I'm fine, Carl, thank you. Then she turned back to Robert, her eyes softening slightly, but still determined. Mr. Miller, as I said, I'm Vivian Holloway. I live here. If you have any concerns, please discuss them with the WA management. I'm sure they can answer any questions you have. Robert Miller looked at Carl, then back at Vivian. He realized he was at a disadvantage. The community's support seemed to lean towards Vivian. Continuing the argument now would likely only make him look ridiculous and isolated. A flicker of frustration and embarrassment crossed Robert's face. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. Robert Miller still stood there, his face filled with suspicion and stubbornness. The challenge in his eyes didn't diminish, despite Vivian's sharp words. Easy enough, Robert said with a mocking smile. If you're really a longtime resident like you say, you must know someone here. Call someone over to vouch for you. Or, as I said, show me your resident card. He crossed his arms, appearing triumphant as if he had cornered Vivian. Vivian looked at Robert, her eyes unwavering at his provocation. She sighed softly, not out of exhaustion, but because of the man's incomprehensible stubbornness. Mr. Miller, Vivian said, her voice maintaining surprising composure. I have no need to prove my identity to you or anyone else just because of your baseless suspicion. I know who I am, and so do my neighbors. She paused, looking directly into Robert's eyes. But perhaps, to put your mind at ease and end your excessive concern about neighborhood security. Vivian smiled slightly, a smile without mockery but with determination. I'll show you something. Vivian slowly reached into her tote bag. Robert Miller and the onlookers watched her every move curiously. In the quiet afternoon air, the sound of the bag's zipper was barely audible. From her bag, Vivian pulled out a familiar black leather wallet. She opened it, and instead of a resident card, she revealed a gold badge glistening in the sunlight. Robert Miller squinted, trying to make out the words engraved on it. A few seconds passed in absolute silence, with only the gentle rustle of leaves in the trees. Finally, Robert seemed to have read the words on the badge. His expression shifted from suspicion to surprise, then gradually to shock and a hint of fear. City of Westwood, Robert stammered, his voice much quieter, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Police Department. Vivian Holloway held the badge in her hand, turning it slightly so Robert could see it clearly. Her eyes remained fixed on his. Yes, Mr. Miller, Vivian said, her voice still calm but with a hint of authority. I'm Vivian Holloway, and I'm not just a resident here. I'm also the police chief of Westwood. Silence enveloped the pool area. The onlookers seemed to hold their breath, unable to believe what they had just heard. Robert Miller stood frozen, his face pale, speechless. His earlier confidence and arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by confusion and a vague sense of fear. Vivian lowered the badge, but her eyes didn't leave Robert. So, Mr. Miller, she said, her voice gentle but with a hidden meaning. Still have doubts about whether I belong here? Robert Miller stood frozen, his eyes wide open, staring at the badge in Vivian's hand as if it were an alien object. His face turned pale, and tiny beads of sweat began to appear on his temples. His earlier confidence and arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by utter confusion and a vague sense of fear lurking in his eyes. The onlookers couldn't hide their surprise either. A few hushed whispers began to spread, and curious and astonished eyes turned towards Vivian and Robert. They had just witnessed an unexpected confrontation, and the revealed truth was more shocking than they could have imagined. Vivian Holloway remained calm, But her eyes didn't leave Robert. She waited for a reaction, an explanation, or at least a clear change in the man's attitude. Finally, Robert swallowed hard, trying to regain his voice. I didn't. That's not what I meant. He stammered, his words disjointed and incoherent. I didn't know. You didn't know? Vivian repeated softly, her voice without mockery, but enough to make Robert feel ashamed. You approached me, questioned me, and demanded I prove my identity just because I was sitting quietly at the community pool where I live. What assumptions were you making? Mr. Miller? Robert bowed his head, unable to look Vivian in the eye. Shame and regret seemed to engulf him. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. I didn't know. I was wrong. Yes, you were wrong, Vivian said, her voice still calm but weighty. You judged a person based on their appearance and your own prejudices. You acted disrespectfully and arrogantly towards someone you didn't even know. She paused, observing Robert's reaction. He still bowed his head, his face full of remorse. But more importantly, Vivian continued, her voice becoming stern. Your actions didn't just offend me. They reflect a larger problem in our society, where those who are different are often suspected and treated unfairly simply because they don't look like what others expect. Vivian retrieved her badge and put it back in her wallet. She looked at Robert with a gaze that was both stern and somewhat sympathetic. Mr. Miller, Vivian said, I am the police chief of this town. My job is to protect everyone, to ensure fairness and respect for all residents. Your actions today went against those values. She took a deep breath. I could choose to handle this in many different ways, but I believe it's more important that you recognize your mistake and change the way you view those around you. Vivian looked directly into Robert's eyes, waiting for a response. Robert looked up, his eyes filled with regret and a hint of anxiety. I'm truly sorry, Chief Holloway, Robert said, his voice more sincere. I was wrong. I acted foolishly and thoughtlessly. I promise this will never happen again. Vivian nodded slightly. I hope so, Mr. Miller, because in Westwood, we are a community, and mutual respect is the foundation for building a strong community. She stood up, picking up her bag. Now, I'd like some peace and quiet. I hope you have a better afternoon. Vivian Holloway paused briefly before walking away. She turned her head back, looking at Robert Miller still standing frozen with remorse and fear. Mr. Miller, Vivian said, her voice still calm but with a hint of firmness. I acknowledge your apology. However, your actions today weren't just a simple lack of courtesy. They revealed a deep-seated prejudice and an attitude of contempt for others based on unfounded assumptions. She took a deep breath. As I said, I am the police chief of this town. I have a responsibility to ensure everyone is treated fairly and respectfully. Your actions created an uncomfortable atmosphere and could have caused harm to others in the community. Vivian looked directly into Robert's eyes, unwavering. Therefore, I won't just stop at an apology. I will require you to take specific action to atone for your behavior. Robert Miller looked at Vivian, his face full of anxiety. What do you want me to do? He stammered. I want you to attend a course on diversity awareness and anti-racism. Vivian said clearly and decisively. I will provide you with information about suitable courses in the area. I want you to attend fully and seriously. Robert opened his mouth to protest, but Vivian's determined gaze silenced him. In addition, Vivian continued, I also want you to publicly apologize to all the residents in the neighborhood at the upcoming community meeting. You need to acknowledge your mistake and commit to behaving more respectfully in the future. Robert's face turned even paler. Having to publicly apologize in front of everyone was no small punishment for him. Robert hesitated. This is not a request, Vivian said, her voice allowing no negotiation. This is necessary for you to understand the true impact of your actions and for the community to see that such behavior will not be tolerated. She looked at Robert once more, her eyes showing no hint of gloating, only the determination of someone representing justice. I will contact the WA management to inform them of this decision. I hope you will cooperate fully. With that, Vivian turned and walked away, leaving Robert Miller standing there, completely defeated. Shame, regret, and anxiety intertwined, forming a heavy burden on his shoulders. He realized that his thoughtless actions not only cost him personally but also affected how the entire community viewed him. The onlookers watched in silence, sensing the severity but fairness in Vivian's handling of the situation. The story at the Westwood pool has come to an end, but the lessons it leaves behind still resonate. Vivian Holloway, with her calm and unwavering demeanor, didn't allow injustice and prejudice to prevail. She taught Robert Miller and the entire community a valuable lesson about respect and fairness. Robert Miller, after realizing his mistake, faced the consequences and committed to change. This story reminds us of the importance of eliminating prejudice, having the courage to stand up against injustice, and building a civilized community where everyone is treated equally. Have you ever experienced a similar situation? What are your thoughts on this story? Please share your opinions in the comments below so we can learn together and build a better community.